The silence over Pearl Harbor was strange, too perfect, too Sunday morning still. December 7th, 1941, and sailors slept past Revel. Officers lingered over coffee, band members polished brass instruments for the morning flag ceremony scheduled for 8 a.m. The USS Arizona sat anchored at Ford Island with 1,812 men aboard, most of them below decks in the cool metal belly of the battleship, washing up, writing letters home, talking about shore leave. On Battleship Row, 8 massive warships floated in formation like monuments to American naval power, untouchable, invincible, drowsy in the tropical dawn. At 3:42 a.m., the minesweeper USS Condor spotted something near the harbor entrance. A periscope, maybe, cutting the dark water like a fin. The report was logged. Nothing happened. At 6:45 a.m., the destroyer USS Ward fired on a Japanese midget submarine attempting to enter the harbor, sinking it with depth charges. The captain radioed headquarters. "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon submarine operating in defensive sea area." The message was received, decoded slowly, filed, no action taken. Those were the first shots of World War II fired by the United States, and no one was listening. At 6:10 a.m., 230 miles north of Oahu, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zukaku, began launching the first wave of attack aircraft. 183 planes lifted into the pre-dawn darkness. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, horizontal bombers, fighters. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the formation, carrying orders that had been sealed until hours before. Pilots learned their target only after takeoff, circling above the carrier decks as the sun broke the horizon behind them. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who opposed the attack and had argued against it, watched the planes disappear south toward Hawaii. He had received the final go signal from Tokyo on December 2nd, climb Mount Nitaka, coded authorization for war. Now there was no turning back. "You're inside this moment now. Stay with us." What happens next changed everything. 2 weeks earlier, Hawaii had been paradise, warm, ordinary, unbothered by the war consuming Europe and Asia. Hubert Dale Gano and his wife Johnny, married just 4 months, lived in base housing near Pearl Harbor. Dale was a Navy officer. Johnny worked as a civilian on base. On Saturday night, December 6th, wealthy Japanese banker threw a lavish party at the officers' club. Music, drinks, laughter late into the night. Some would later wonder if it had been planned, a distraction, a final gesture before the storm. The base had been on full alert for 10 days leading up to December 6th. No one allowed off base, heightened security, whispers of something coming. Then, on Saturday afternoon, the alert was suddenly canceled. Soldiers went into Honolulu, sailors got drunk. Officers visited their families. At Wheeler Field and Hickam Field, the air bases flanking Pearl Harbor, aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip on the tarmac to prevent sabotage. Packed so tightly they couldn't be dispersed quickly. Couldn't take off in formation, couldn't defend anything. The precaution against sabotage became an invitation to annihilation. At 7:02 a.m. on December 7th, 2 Army privates manning a mobile radar station at Opana Point, on Oahu's northern shore, detected a massive formation of aircraft approaching from the north. More than 50 planes, the largest blip they'd ever seen on the primitive oscilloscope. They called it in to the information center at Fort Shafter. At 7:20 a.m., an Army lieutenant on duty, inexperienced, alone, overwhelmed, dismissed the report. He assumed the radar contact was a flight of B-17 bombers expected from California that morning. "Don't worry about it," he told the radar operators. The privates went back to watching the blip grow larger, closer, undeniable. At 7:40 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft reached Oahu. They came in low over the mountains, skimming treetops, engines roaring, shadows racing across sugarcane fields and pineapple plantations. Commander Fuchida circled once, surveying the harbor below. Battleships lined up perfectly, aircraft parked in neat rows, no defensive fighters in the air, no alarm, no movement. He gave the signal to attack at 7:49 a.m. At 7:53 a.m., he transmitted the code, confirming total surprise. Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. The message crackling back to the carrier fleet that the Americans had been caught sleeping. At 7:55 a.m., the first bombs fell. The sound came before comprehension, explosions that felt like earthquakes, rattling windows, shaking foundations. Dale Gano and his wife were still in bed, debating whether to attend church in Honolulu. The first blast jerked them awake. Johnny thought a plane had crashed nearby. They rushed outside in pajamas, joining their neighbor, a Navy doctor who was staring at the sky through binoculars. Dale didn't need binoculars. He could see the red circles painted on the wings, the rising sun insignia stark against silver fuselages. "They are Japanese," he said, his voice flat with disbelief. On Ford Island, 8-year-old Thomas Gillette was playing in his neighbor's front yard when the first torpedo bombers roared overhead, so low he could see the pilots' faces. He shouted in excitement, thinking it was a drill, pointing at the planes as his friend Monty stood transfixed beside him. Thomas's mother ran from the house, her face white, and screamed words he'd never heard her use. "Get in the damned house!" She never swore, never raised her voice, but now she was shouting, shoving the boys inside, ordering them into the brick fireplace, the only structure that might survive a direct hit. Upstairs, Thomas's sister Lydia was asleep when machine gun bullets tore through the wall beside her bed, passing inches above her head. She woke to the sound of ripping wood and shattered plaster, sat up confused, and walked onto the roof outside her bedroom window. Low-flying aircraft screamed past just above the palm trees in her yard. She thought it was realistic training until her mother's voice cut through the noise, screaming from next door, "They're attacking us!" At Hickam Field, the adjacent Army air base, dive bombers strafed the parked aircraft with methodical precision. Planes exploded where they sat, fuel tanks rupturing, fires spreading across the tarmac in pools of burning aviation gas. A bomb hit hangar number 7 and detonated inside, the concussion wave blowing men off ladders, through windows, into cactus plants 20 feet away. Soldiers ran for cover, but there was no cover, just open ground, parked vehicles, and bullets chewing up the concrete in straight lines. On Battleship Row, torpedo bombers swept in at mast height, released their payloads into the shallow harbor, torpedoes specifically designed for Pearl Harbor's 40-foot depth, a technical innovation the Americans had believed impossible. The torpedoes knifed through the water, 30 knots, no deviation, slamming into the hulls of the moored battleships with concussive force that lifted entire ships sideways. At 8:05 a.m., the USS Oklahoma was hit by the first torpedo. Then a second, a third, a fourth, 5 torpedoes in total, all striking the port side within minutes. The battleship shuddered, groaned, and began to capsize. Men scrambled up ladders as the decks tilted 40 degrees, then 90, the ship rolling over like a dying whale. 429 men were trapped inside when the Oklahoma capsized completely, settling upside down in the mud, with her hull exposed to the sky. Some drowned instantly as compartments flooded. Others were crushed by machinery that broke loose and tumbled through the inverted ship. A few found air pockets in the darkness and waited, pounding on the steel hull, screaming for help that wouldn't come for hours, for days, or never. At 8:10 a.m., 15 minutes into the attack, a Japanese high-altitude bomber flying at 10,000 feet released a 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb, a modified naval shell fitted with fins, directly above the USS Arizona. The bomb fell for 8 seconds, accelerating to terminal velocity, and struck the forward deck near the second gun turret. It punched through the deck armor, through 2 more decks below, and detonated inside the forward ammunition magazine where over 1 million pounds of gunpowder and high explosives were stored. The explosion was cataclysmic. The entire forward section of the Arizona erupted in a fireball that rose 500 feet into the air, a mushroom cloud visible from Honolulu 10 miles away. The blast wave flattened men on adjacent ships. The sound, described by survivors as indescribable, was felt more than heard. A physical pressure that collapsed lungs, ruptured eardrums, stopped hearts. The Arizona broke apart, her bow lifting momentarily before the ship settled into the harbor floor, sinking in 9 minutes. 1,177 men died, most of them instantly vaporized or incinerated in the magazine explosion. Others drowned as compartments flooded. Still others burned to death in oil fires that spread across the water's surface. Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd and Captain Franklin van Valkenburg were on the bridge when the bomb hit. Neither body was ever recovered. Admiral Kidd became the first flag officer killed in the Pacific War. His death confirmed only by his Naval Academy class ring, found fused to a piece of the ship's superstructure. On the Arizona's quarterdeck, sailors abandoned ship into water that was no longer water, but a burning slick of oil. Bunker fuel leaking from ruptured tanks, igniting on contact with debris and sparks. Men swam through flames, their uniforms soaking up oil, their hair catching fire. Some made it to Ford Island. Others disappeared beneath the burning surface, pulled down by their shoes, their clothes, their panic. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua, the ship's damage control officer, survived the initial blast and immediately began organizing firefighting efforts and evacuating the wounded. He ordered all surviving crew to abandon ship as the fire overwhelmed the vessel, flames consuming everything combustible. Fuqua remained aboard until he was certain no living men remained, then was among the last to leave, swimming through oil and fire to reach shore. He was later awarded the Medal of Honor. At 8 a.m., Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, transmitted the message that erased all doubt. This is no drill, but by then 5 battleships had been hit. The Arizona was exploding, the Oklahoma was capsized, and the harbor was chaos. Smoke, fire, screaming, the drone of aircraft engines circling for another pass. If stories like this matter, subscribe, keep history alive. The USS West Virginia absorbed 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs, her hull shredded, fires raging on multiple decks. 106 men died, many trapped in flooded compartments with no way out. The ship settled upright into the harbor mud, sinking slowly, giving some crew time to escape but dooming others who couldn't reach ladders or hatches before the water rose above their heads. The USS California took 2 torpedoes and a bomb, flooding through ruptured compartments, listing heavily. 105 men died, some in the initial explosions, others trapped below decks as water rose inch by inch in the darkness. Rescue crews worked frantically, cutting through bulkheads with torches, shouting into flooded spaces, listening for responses that sometimes came and sometimes didn't. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, attempted to escape the harbor. She was struck by a bomb near the bow, then targeted by every available dive bomber, because sinking her in the harbor channel would have bottled up the entire Pacific Fleet. Her crew ran her aground deliberately at Hospital Point to avoid blocking the channel. The ship's hull torn open, her decks aflame, but still floating, still fighting. At 8:54 a.m., the second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived, 170 planes, mostly dive bombers and fighters. The first wave had achieved total surprise. The second wave met resistance, anti-aircraft fire from ships and shore batteries, desperate and disorganized but lethal. American gunners fired anything they could load. 5-inch guns, machine guns, rifles, pistols. Some sailors manned guns on sinking ships, standing waist-deep in water, firing until the guns went under or the ammunition ran out. At 9:30 a.m., the destroyer USS Shaw, dry-docked for maintenance, took a direct bomb hit to her forward magazine. The resulting explosion was photographed by multiple witnesses, a massive fireball erupting from the dry dock, the ship's bow disintegrating, metal fragments raining down across the harbor. The image became iconic, one of the most reproduced photographs of the attack. By 10:00 a.m., the attack was over. The Japanese aircraft turned north, returning to their carriers, leaving behind a harbor transformed into a graveyard. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, 3 light cruisers damaged, 3 destroyers damaged, 4 auxiliary vessels sunk. 188 aircraft destroyed, 159 aircraft damaged, and 2,403 Americans dead, 2,008 Navy, 218 Army, 109 Marines, 68 civilians killed in 90 minutes on a Sunday morning. Vice Admiral Nagumo, aboard the flagship Akagi, 230 miles north, faced immediate pressure from his officers to launch a third wave, to destroy the fuel storage tanks, the submarine base, the repair facilities, destroy those they argued, and Pearl Harbor would be unusable for months, maybe years. But Nagumo, cautious and aware that American carriers remained unlocated, refused. He ordered the fleet to withdraw, heading northwest at maximum speed, fearing a counterattack that never came because there were no operational American aircraft to launch it. The fires burned for days. The Arizona burned for 2 full days, the oil slick around her smoldering, impossible to extinguish. Bodies floated in the harbor, tangled in debris, covered in oil, some burned beyond recognition. Navy personnel worked in shifts, recovering the dead, cataloging the remains, trying to identify men whose faces no longer existed. Medical stations were overwhelmed. Hickam Field reported 191 dead and hundreds wounded. The base hospital ran out of supplies, space, and staff within hours. Rescue operations continued for days after the attack. On the capsized Oklahoma, survivors trapped inside pounded on the hull with wrenches, hammers, anything metal. Rescue crews used stethoscopes to locate the sounds, then cut through the hull with acetylene torches, racing against time as air pockets shrank and water rose. 32 men were pulled alive from the Oklahoma, some after more than 24 hours in pitch darkness. But hundreds remained entombed, their knocking growing fainter, then stopping. In a sealed storeroom deep inside the Oklahoma, 3 sailors, Ronald Endicott, Clifford Olds, and Louis Buddy Costin, survived the initial sinking. They found themselves in an airtight compartment with emergency rations and fresh water. They kept a calendar marking each day in red pencil. 16 days were crossed off when their bodies were finally recovered months later during salvage operations. They had survived for more than 2 weeks in absolute darkness, in a tomb of steel, surrounded by the bodies of their shipmates, waiting for rescue that never came because cutting through the oil-soaked hull risked igniting fires and explosions that would have killed anyone still alive inside. The brothers of Costin and Olds learned the truth from friends in the service but never told their parents, choosing to let them believe their sons had died instantly, painlessly, on December 7th. The official death date for all 3 men was recorded as December 7th, 1941, even though they lived until at least December 23rd. The Navy made that decision to spare families the agony of knowing their sons had survived the attack only to die slowly, alone, in the dark. 49 civilians died in the attack. Some were killed by Japanese bombs and strafing. Others were killed by American anti-aircraft shells that failed to detonate in the air and fell back to Earth, exploding in residential neighborhoods miles from the harbor. A woman writing to her parents hours after the attack described the terror of being unable to distinguish between incoming fire and friendly fire. of not knowing where safety existed because death came from the sky in all directions. On December 8, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. His speech lasted 6 minutes. He called December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, and requested a declaration of war against Japan. Congress voted 82-0 in the Senate and 388-1 in the House, the sole dissenting vote cast by Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a pacifist who had also voted against U.S. entry into World War I. The declaration was signed within hours. America was at war. 3 days later, on December 11th, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy declared war on the United States in accordance with their tripartite pact with Japan. America, which had spent 2 years avoiding involvement in the global conflict, was now fully committed to a two-ocean war. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not spontaneous. Planning had begun months earlier under the direction of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet. Yamamoto opposed war with the United States, believing Japan could not win a prolonged conflict against America's industrial capacity. But if war was inevitable, he argued, Japan's only chance was to deliver a crippling first strike that would destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet and buy time for Japan to consolidate territorial gains in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The plan was audacious and risky, sailing 6 aircraft carriers across 3,500 miles of open ocean undetected, launching a surprise attack hundreds of miles from land, and withdrawing before American forces could respond. It required perfect weather, perfect timing, perfect secrecy. Any one failure, if the fleet was spotted, if storms delayed the approach, if intelligence leaked, would result in disaster, but the plan worked flawlessly. The Japanese strike force maintained radio silence for 2 weeks, refueled at sea, navigated by dead reckoning through fog and rain, and arrived at the launch point undetected. American intelligence had intercepted diplomatic communications between Tokyo and the Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C., throughout late November and early December. The messages indicated that war was imminent, but they did not specify Pearl Harbor as a target. American military planners assumed any Japanese attack would strike the Philippines, Malaya, or the Dutch East Indies, targets that aligned with Japan's strategic need for oil and rubber. The possibility of a carrier strike against Pearl Harbor had been theorized but dismissed as too risky, too impractical, too far. The dismissal was wrong. The attack succeeded tactically but failed strategically. Japan destroyed or damaged 8 battleships, but all except the Arizona and Oklahoma were eventually raised, repaired, and returned to service. More critically, the Japanese failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks, repair facilities, and submarine base, the infrastructure necessary to sustain the Pacific Fleet. And they failed to locate and sink the U.S. aircraft carriers, which were at sea during the attack and became the foundation of America's counteroffensive in the Pacific. Most importantly, the attack unified American public opinion overnight. Before December 7, 1941, America was deeply divided over involvement in World War II. Isolationists argued against foreign wars. Interventionists warned of the Nazi and Japanese threat. After December 7th, the debate was over. Enlistment stations were overwhelmed with volunteers. War production shifted into overdrive. The sleeping giant had awakened. Admiral Yamamoto allegedly said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether he actually spoke those words is disputed, but the sentiment was accurate. Japan won the battle. America won the war. 79 years later, the USS Arizona remains at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, entombed with over 900 men who were declared buried at sea. The ship still leaks oil, about a quart per day, a slow hemorrhage called the Tears of the Arizona. A memorial straddles the sunken hull, visited by millions, a white structure floating above rusted steel and bones. The USS Oklahoma was salvaged in 1943, refloated and sold for scrap in 1946. She sank again while being towed to California, disappearing into deep water 500 miles northeast of Hawaii. But the work to identify her dead continued. Starting in 2015, the Defense WWII accounting agency exhumed nearly 400 unidentified remains from the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu and used DNA analysis to identify them. As of 2024, over 300 sailors and Marines from the Oklahoma have been positively identified and returned to their families for burial. The work continues. Every December 7th, survivors who are still alive, fewer each year, return to Pearl Harbor. They are in their 90s and hundreds now, the last living witnesses to a morning when the world changed in 90 minutes. They tell stories of fire and oil, of ships that exploded, of friends who didn't make it off the Arizona, of the sound of torpedoes hitting steel, of swimming through burning water, of picking up rifles and firing at planes until the magazines were empty. Jack Holder, a Navy seaman on Ford Island, huddled in a ditch as a Japanese pilot strafed his position again and again, bullets chewing up the ground inches away. He prayed, "God, please don't let me die in this ditch," and survived. He spent the rest of the morning pulling wounded men from the water, from burning ships, from wreckage that was still hot to the touch. Loren Bruner, a fire controlman on the Arizona, was on the mainmast when the magazine exploded beneath him. He and 5 others climbed to the top of the burning mast, then jumped across a 70-foot gap to the repair ship Vestal, which was moored alongside. Bruner was the last living survivor of the Arizona. He died in 2019 and had his ashes interred in the submerged wreckage with his shipmates. The attack lasted 90 minutes. The consequences lasted 80 years and counting. On the morning of December 7, 1941, at 7:55 a.m., fire fell from a clear sky. The sun rose over Hawaii and illuminated a harbor transformed from peace to war in the span of a breath. Sailors who had been asleep were dead before they woke. Ships that had been symbols of power became tombs. A nation that had been at peace was suddenly, irrevocably, at war. That morning over Oahu, the sky was not dawn. It was flame, and in that flame a new world was born. A world of total war, of atomic weapons, of superpower rivalry, of American global dominance forged in the fires of Pearl Harbor. The sleeping giant never slept soundly again. The blast ended in 90 minutes, but its echo rewrote the century. If this story moved you, subscribe and keep its echo alive.